So again, this is a reminder that if you didn't print this, you need to copy what you see, leave enough space so that you can clearly mark up the argument. I cannot stress that enough because if you don't leave line spaces, then you're not going to be able to mark up this in a way that is appropriate. Your markups have to look like mine. So when I say the label is above and at the beginning, you can't have all your labels over here with arrows. So it's very important to follow the instructions. Okay, and you will be turning in some of the examples, and I will be telling you how to turn in evidence of your engagement, but I'll get to that in a later video. All right, so at this point, I'm going to encourage you to do all of argument 7, that is bracket and number the statements and then label them as a premise or a conclusion. If you're getting the hang of things and you don't want to look at your notes first, you can try it that way. And then you can then you might want to check your notes just to make sure you didn't forget something, and then check your answer with me. Assuming you've done all that and practiced, I'm going to go ahead and go through the analysis. Aren't you ignoring Floyd's bad deeds? Question. So I'm not going to bracket because it's this question. While I admit that what you said about human worth and dignity is true, so while I admit, so that right there would be a sentence fragment if I bracketed it by itself. While I admit that what you said, so no, I can't bracket that as a statement. If I do, I'm going to create a sentence fragment. What if I said, while you want to pass this class, so that must mean that this part has to be bracketed if there is a statement after it. So they say, I still very strongly believe that it is not right to present someone in only a positive light when said person fails to recognize the dignity and worth of others. Statement 1. So as you can see through our examples, statements can be really long, but they can also be really short. This is a really long one. All right. Thus, let me see if I can work on the lighting. No, okay. Thus, here. That helps. Okay, so thus, am I still of the opinion that it was wrong to eulogize Floyd in that kind of light? So, as you can see, that's a conclusion indicator. And we have, am I still of the opinion? So when you put thus, if I said, am I still of the opinion, that would be a question mark. But because the conclusion indicator is there, that's not the case. But really, the core of the statement is right here. And you'll understand more why I leave out words like the opinion that. I would also probably leave out words like I think that when they're at the beginning, but we'll learn more about why later. But right now we can just go with the core of the statement, which is right here. The emphasis is not that they have an opinion. The emphasis is on what? The conclusion that captures their opinion, which is right here. Okay, it was wrong to eulogize Floyd in that kind of light. And then we've got, after all, he himself once violated the human worth and dignity of a pregnant woman by holding a gun to her head while others robbed her. Okay, so we've got that statement, we've got this statement, and we've got this statement right here. So, as I'm hoping you saw, there was a huge conclusion indicator, thus. So that tells us a conclusion is coming. You then should have marked statement 1 as a premise, and are you surprised to learn that you mark statement 3 as a premise? So of course, I'm assuming that you're looking at your list of premise and conclusion indicator words, and you should have after all as a premise. I recommend that you write on your warnings and tips right here, the optional notes. I'm going to write this one down, it's so important, but again, this is optional. After all always means you are looking at a premise indicator. And of course, when I say premise indicator, we mean a reason is being given or it's about to be presented. I know intuitively it feels like from everyday life we're coming to a conclusion, like you tell a story and then you say, like, after all that, can you believe he still purchased that thing? But you've got to fight against your intuitive everyday understanding of after all and understand the logician sense of after all. So you might want to also write as a tip and as a warning. Whenever you see after all, you must interpret it as a premise indicator if it is in fact pointing to a statement that has a function in an argument. All right, so let's go ahead and do the pattern. I'm going to put the pattern up here. We're going to need all of the space later, so don't write below the space. I'm going to squeeze the pattern in here. So the pattern is PCP. And then the diagram would be S3, premise, works together with S1, another premise, in support of S2, a conclusion. Notice how when I have a plus sign between just two statements, I put the arrow directly below the plus sign. If you have an argument with more than 3 premises, you can just put the arrow in the middle of the row capturing those arguments. I know that we looked at one a minute ago, and now I'm having trouble finding what the heck. Oh, there it is. Here, I put the arrow, since there's 2 pluses, I just put the arrow in the middle. But the idea is to put it in the middle of the row that has the premises. Okay, so if you were doing this argument and this was your only item for a grade, you would get 100 at this point. Okay, so let's go on to argument 8. Again, I encourage you to apply everything. So now I encourage you to apply everything and anything you've learned to do with arguments. Remember markup, symbolization, pattern diagrams, the rules that you need to follow in doing your markup exactly like me. You're going to do this throughout the semester for a grade. So pause the video and try, and then learn from your mistakes. Okay, so assuming you've done that, you have a good point, man. That's a statement for sure. I can see where you are coming from in your reasoning to your conclusion. Wow, that's really strong evidence, right, that this person reflects intellectual empathy. How does this sound? Oh, question, not going to bracket it. It is morally permissible to hold some kind of solemn service and remembrance for every human. Okay, so that's a statement. But, oh, here's another statement. If the person being eulogized has done bad deeds, that person should not be remembered as purely good. Say, what? Did some of you put a closing bracket there? Did some of you put a bracket like that? Notice what you have done if you did that. If the person being eulogized has done bad deeds, what have you created? A sentence fragment. You cannot do that with if-then statements. There is an implied then in here. It's not explicit, but it's implied. So this brings us to the last lesson that we need to put in our mandatory notes. Okay? So now what I want to talk about are conditional statements. Let me stop that call. Okay. Sorry for the interruption, and I forgot to put an L here. So let's talk about conditional statements. You'll recognize conditional statements in an argument or in a passage or in a paragraph or an explanation when you see somebody saying, if blah, 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 then blah, blah, blah. I'm putting then in parentheses because sometimes the then is implied, it's understood, it's not always there. A lot of the times, though, you will see the word then. You don't have to have the word then for something to be a conditional. So a conditional is merely hypothetical. Hypothetical. It says, if something is the case, then something else is also the case. You should, so, and then a form, a way to think of it in terms of a form is if X stands for some claim, then, or belief, Y. Okay? So in big capital letters, I want you to write, never, ever chop a conditional. Sometimes I refer to conditional statements just as conditional. Never ever chop a conditional in half while bracketing. If you do that, you're going to create a sentence fragment. Not only that, you're going to tear up somebody's reasoning, because in their reasoning, they're using conditional thinking. They're thinking hypothetically. If you destroy the conditional by chopping it in half, you've destroyed their hypothetical reasoning. So I want you to also write that if is not ever a premise indicator. P means premise indicator. Very important. I cannot tell you how important that is. But that's basically our lesson to draw from the arguments. So you should have bracketed the entire conditional statement. This is statement 4. What follows is this. It sounds like they're asking a question, but they're not. They're just saying this is what follows. What follows is this. So that is a statement. Okay. And then they have, it is at least somewhat reasonable to think that it would have been morally permissible to hold a solemn service for him had those who did so not present him as such. That would be statement 5. Okay, let's go ahead and identify the premises and the conclusion. So, do we have any indicator words to help us isolate? We do have an indicator phrase, and in fact, we have a statement, and the only function of that statement is to tell us a conclusion is coming. Do you know which statement tells us a conclusion is coming? Look at your list of conclusion indicators. Do you see a word that's typically used as a conclusion indicator? What about follows? It follows is often used as a conclusion indicator. This is just another variation of that. What follows is this. In other words, here comes a statement, a belief, a conclusion that follows from what? Things I've already said prior to statement 5. So this is a conclusion. Some students label statement 3 as a conclusion, but it's not. The entire statement is itself a conclusion indicator. So make sure you don't do things like label a Make sure that when you're looking at statements, make sure that the statement itself is not a premise or conclusion indicator. If the entire statement is that, you do bracket it and number it, but you don't label it as an actual premise or conclusion. It's just an indicator. So you might want to add here, just really small, that let's do it as a warning. So you might want to add, sometimes an entire statement is a premise or conclusion indicator. Sometimes an entire statement is a premise or conclusion indicator. Never label an indicator as a premise or conclusion. Okay, so that's the conclusion, and it says what follows. So we know that they think they have at least one premise. I use my college level reading skills. I realize that this is also a premise. What about I can see where you are coming from in your reasoning to your conclusion? Does that support the conclusion that is stated here about moral permissibility of a service? No. This just says I can follow an argument that you gave earlier. So we don't label that. You have a good point. That's a term of evaluation, right? They're evaluating. They're saying you have a good point. But that does nothing to advance the conclusion here. So we wouldn't label those. So now what we have here for the pattern is, I'm going to squeeze it in right here. No, I can do it right here. We have at least one premise. Remember, P means at least one, followed by a conclusion. The diagram would be statement 3, a premise. It works together with statement 4, another premise, to support another statement 5, a conclusion. Leave all of this space blank. Okay, we'll do a new video for this set of arguments.